everybody. It is so good to have you here. By the way, Ed, am I in the camera? Or is my head cut off?
Your head is cut off.
My head's cut off. Got it. Man, let me fix it real quick. Sorry, this happens when you run your own AV, you know, you gotta... I'm sure people really want to see the top of my head, so put it right there. That way if you want to watch this screen, you can. Okay, let's try that again. Good evening, everybody. And is that better? My head. Yes. Okay, awesome. It's so good to have you all here for another Shmord program. For those of you who I don't know, who I don't think is anyone in here that I don't know, my name is Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and I am the director of Partners in Torah Cleveland. And we do this Partners in Torah program once a week here at the Federation. We have the Shmord program once a month, and we do a lot of other cool stuff too that you can check out on our website. You can hear from me here tonight. We have different podcasts that we do. We have our young professional program called Torah on Tap. We have Lunch and Learns, and the big event we have coming up is our 5th anniversary celebration 1 week from tomorrow night at the Silver Grill downtown. Going to be an awesome evening catered by the Ritz-Carlton with guest speaker Rabbi Yosef Frand, and we're honoring Mrs. Dina Israeli from the room next door. And it's going to be a great evening. If you have not bought your tickets yet, I know who you are and I know where you live. So no, please, it's not too late. We hope to see you there. It's going to be a really great celebration and a great event. On to our topic for tonight. So, in my line of work, you often want to come up with a topic that is both creative, interesting, and somehow reflects what it is you were planning to talk about. So I'm curious how many people in this room saw my topic and had absolutely no clue what in the world I was planning to speak about. You don't have to, okay, you can raise your hand, great. So thank you. You're really just here because you figured, you know, Landis is loud and he runs his mouth really fast, so I'll go and listen and maybe it'll be good, maybe it won't. But the topic that I gave this class is called The Nick is the Way, the Jewish Roots of Stoicism. And as we go on for the next few moments tonight, we'll understand exactly what that means and why I chose that particular topic for this discussion. But I want to start this discussion where everything begins for us Jews, right in the 5 books of Moses, right in the Torah, almost at the beginning of the Torah. We meet one of our matriarchs by the name of Rebecca, and she's pregnant. And she is feeling birth pains, and it's very difficult for her. And she says a line when she's feeling her birth pains. She says, "Lama ze anochi." Like if this is what birth and this is being pregnant is all about, I don't want any of this. Okay? So she wants to get an idea as to what's going on. So she goes to talk to the great prophet of that time. She goes to the yeshiva Shem Neighbor to try and seek counsel about what's going on. And they tell her, she says, "Don't worry. You're actually pregnant with twins." This was the original ultrasound. You went to a prophet. He told you what you're having. You're pregnant with twins, both males. And each one is going to be a nation. Each one is going to be a very powerful nation, and that's what's going to happen. And Rashi, in his commentary, tells us something very interesting. He says that the picture is painted kind of rosy for what the eventuality of history was, because we know that those two children were Jacob and Esau. And Esau wasn't such a good guy, and he's been really the tormentor of the Jewish people from that point forward in history. So how is it that the picture was painted kind of rosy when it's not really such a rosy situation? So Rashi explains that there will be one time period in history when the descendants of Yaakov, the descendants of Jacob, and the descendants of Esau will get along, and because of that, you know, that made everything pretty much okay for Rivka. Now think about that for a moment, and think about our history. Because when we talk about Esau, there's some nations and descendants and whatnot that we know coming straight from Esau. For example, Amalek, the great tormentor of the Jewish people after they leave Egypt. He's a descendant of Esau. Rome, the ones who destroyed the Second Temple and the Second Commonwealth, they are descendants of Esau. And we typically talk about any enemy of the Jewish people as a descendant from Esau. But there was one time in history where they got along. How's that a consolation? How would that calm you down if you're a mother about to give birth to 2 children who are going to be in a sibling rivalry their whole life? So the answer that's given is Rashi says specifically, it was a specific time and 2 specific people that were going to get along. One's name was Rebbe, also known as Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Judah the Prince, and the other one was Antoninus, a Roman emperor by the name of Antoninus. and they were going to get along, and everything was going to be fine. Okay, so we can identify them. Now we know who we're talking about. We're talking circa 2nd century of the Common Era. Judah the Prince is the leader of the Jews. Antoninus is the leader of the Romans. The temple's been destroyed already for about 100 years. So fine, they got along. What's the big deal? There's no temple anymore. The Jews are in exile. 1 million Jews were just killed by the Romans 100 years before. So what's so special? So the explanation that's given on that is that those two people, Rebbe and Antoninus, would have such a powerful relationship with each other that Rebbe would become like a teacher, not like a teacher, he would become the teacher of Antoninus. And he would teach Antoninus everything he knew. And Antoninus would give the Jewish people essentially carte blanche. He would leave them alone from the Roman persecution which they had become so accustomed to. And because of that, at that time period, Judah the Prince took the opportunity. He said, we have a problem here. The Jewish people are in exile. This exile is not going to be a short exile. From Sinai until that point in history, the Jewish law was not written down in any way, shape, or form. Because you really didn't need it written down. If you're living in a country where it's the law of the land, you don't need it written down. I mean, how many people know where to look up the law that if you speed, you get a speeding ticket? I don't know where to look it up. I mean, there's a lawyer in the room who can tell me where to look it up. We know it's the law of the land. We live the law, so we know the law. That's how the Torah law was when the Jews lived in Israel. The Rebbe said, we have a problem. We're not living in Israel anymore. We're in exile. We've got to start writing this down. And he was able to redact and write down the Mishnah, which is the foundation of Jewish law as we have it today. So explain the commentaries, because he had that benevolent relationship with Antoninus, it gave him the peace that he needed to be able to write down the Mishnah so that we could still have a Jewish people and be a nation in exile. Right? The great secret that the Dalai Lama wants to know. There's a book written called The Jew and the Lotus about how the Dalai Lama approached the Jewish people. How do you guys survive in exile? You've done it for thousands of years. And he wrote this like 3 decades into his exile. It's because Yehuda Nasi. It's because of the rabbis who wrote it down, who turned us from a state nation into a nation in exile. And it was able to happen because of that relationship between Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and Antoninus. Question is, who is Antoninus? Anyone in here an expert in Roman history? I know I'm not. But one thing I do know is there was never an emperor by the name of Antoninus. That's the name that the Talmud calls him. That's the name that Josephus calls him. That's the name that the Jewish historians call him. But it's clearly a name referring to someone else. So who is that person? It happens to be a great debate in Jewish history as to who Antoninus was. But the predominant opinion, the most, I guess the majority opinion, if you will, is that Antoninus was an emperor by the name of Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was the Roman emperor from about the year 160 to the year 180, so it overlaps very nicely with when Judah the Prince was the head of the Jewish people. And according to most historians, Marcus Aurelius is Antoninus. So what this means is not only was there a gift given to the Jewish people that we were able to have the peace of mind to write down the Mishnah and make a plan for the Jewish people to be sustained in exile because of that relationship between Marcus Aurelius and Judah the Prince, but there's something very special that I believe Rabbi Yehuda Nasi gave over to the world through Marcus Aurelius. And that is something known as Stoicism. Marcus Aurelius is considered by most historians to be the founder of the philosophy of Stoicism. So what exactly is Stoicism? So we can go to Marcus Aurelius' own words, and we can sum it up in 2 sentences. The impediment to action advances action, and what stands in the way becomes the way. That is essentially summing up the idea of Stoicism in one statement. So the idea of Stoicism is that when you have an obstacle, or based on my title, a nick, and you get nicked by something, or if we flip it over to Hebrew, we say a nikshol, which is the Hebrew word for obstacle, the nick becomes the way. The obstacle becomes the way. That is Stoicism. That is what Marcus Aurelius taught his students. That is what Marcus Aurelius lived, and that is a philosophy that has lived on from Marcus Aurelius until this day. So what I would like to show you in the few minutes we have together is that this philosophy, which has paved the ways for so many great philosophers, business people, education people throughout history, is a Jewish philosophy that came from that relationship that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi had with Marcus Aurelius. The question is, who is the first person ever to record this philosophy? Who is the first person to really ever teach us about Stoicism? It was none other than our teacher Moses, the Moshe Rabbeinu. At the point when he was seemingly closest with the Almighty through his 40 years of the Jewish people, it was after the golden calf. It was after God had said he would forgive the Jews and he would give them a second chance. At that point, Moses was as close to the Almighty as he would be in all of his 40 years as the main prophet of the Jewish people. And when he had that relationship, what is the question that he took the opportunity to ask the Almighty? Well, it happens to be the very question that Mrs. Israeli is discussing next door. Why do bad things happen to good people? Or as our sages and the philosophers write it down in Hebrew, Tzadik v'rolo, Rasha v'tovlo. Right? Righteous people have bad things happen, evil people have good things happen. Ask Moses the Almighty, why is that so in the world? So the Almighty answers in the cryptic way that I assume he usually answers if you're a prophet. I'm not there yet, I'm still working on it. But the Almighty says to Moses, I'm going to give you the answer. Go sit over there in that cleft of a rock, right over there. You can't understand me by looking head on. You can only understand me when I pass you by. And the Torah describes the Almighty passes by Moses, and Moses doesn't see the front of the Almighty, but he sees the back. And our sages tell us that what's he see? He sees the knot of God's tefillin. Which begs the question, does God really wear tefillin? Or which begs the bigger question, does God have a head? Okay, we'll leave that for another time. Maybe the next shmor will be about, does God have a head? But be it as it may, that's what the Medrash tells us. That Moses saw the knot of God's tefillin. And that was the answer to the big question, why do bad things happen to good people? Okay, thank you very much. We'll see you next week. Now, how is that an answer? So obviously this is a homiletic explanation of something much more profound and powerful that was going on. And the commentaries tell us that what are tefillin? Imagine if you ever see someone wearing tefillin. What do you see when you look at them head on? You see a big black box right up here, and you see two black straps hanging down over here. Now, if you don't know what tefillin are, and you're only looking at the person head on, do you know that those 2 or 3 items are connected? You don't know that. You might think he's got a funny hat on and he's wearing a scarf or something like that. But then if the person turns around, all of a sudden you see what? What do you see from the back? You see that everything is tied together. That black box has a strap going through it, has straps hanging down, it's all tied together. So you say, all this time I thought those were 3 separate unrelated items. Now I see they're all tied together. Now I see they're all connected. And that's what the Almighty answers to Moses. He says, you're looking at events head on. If you look at events head on, you're right, they look bad. They look terrible. They look like obstacles. They look like difficulties. But you can't look at things head on. You have to look at them after they pass. After you see that this thing that seemed like an obstacle, that made me into the person I had to be. And this thing that tripped me up over here, that got me to where I needed to be on that day. Because the obstacle is the way. That's what the Almighty tells Moses. The nick is the way. That's how you're going to get there. So long before Marcus Aurelius made this philosophy famous, Moshe was already having the discussion with the Almighty. And we can fast forward a few hundred years to the great philosopher King Solomon. King Solomon blessed us with many wonderful philosophical works. And in one of his philosophical works, he has a verse that my wife is sitting here, she'll tell me I quote it way too much, but it's a verse that I always try and say to myself, which, by the way, I'll have you know, I'm not speaking to any of you right now. I'm speaking to myself, because it's something that I'm working on very deeply, and I'm letting you listen. So a verse that I always say to myself is the famous verse from King Solomon, Sheva yipol tzadik v'kom, that a righteous person falls 7 times and still gets up. So what exactly does that mean? So the great Rabbi Hutner, who was the head of the Chaim Berlin Yeshiva in New York, once got a letter from a student who had left the yeshiva long before, gone into the workforce, got married, had kids, and was living the life that everyone's living. And he writes his teacher, and he says, back when I was in yeshiva, everything was great. I was growing, I was living a spiritual life, it was tremendous, I was in that bubble, but here I am 15 years later, I go to work, I come home, maybe I go to synagogue, maybe I do this, maybe I do that, and I'm just not the person I used to be. I stumble all over the place, I do things I'm not happy about, and how am I supposed to deal with these things? So says Rabbi Hutner to a student, he says, you understood the verse from King Solomon incorrectly. Most of us would translate that verse, Sheva Yipol Tzaddik V'Kom, that a righteous person falls 7 times and gets up, and think that we're describing the trait of a righteous person. Then how do you know someone's righteous? What's one of the ways you can tell somebody's righteous? If when they fall, they get up. Says in footnote, that's all wrong. It's Sheva Yipol Tzaddik V'Kom. How is it that a person becomes a tzaddik? How is it that a person becomes a righteous person? When you fall, you get up. That's how you turn into a righteous person. You know how you remain an average person, or dare I say an evil person? When you fall, you stay down. Says King Solomon, you want to be righteous? When you fall, you get up. When there's a stumbling block, you embrace it and you move forward. And you understand how this is supposed to make you into the person that you are trying to become. So that's King Solomon teaching us the words which later became known as Stoicism. And then in the Talmud, we have a very famous person. A very famous person, if you know who he is. If you don't know who he is, he's not so famous. His name is Nachum Ish Gamzu, which basically means Nachum, the man of Gamzu. What does Gamzu mean? So the Talmud tells us it's really short for a statement that he would always say. He would always walk around saying a statement, Gamzu Latova, which literally translates as, this will also be good. And because he always made that statement, he was given the name Nachum Ish Gamzu. What does it mean, this will also be good? It doesn't mean, by the way, that I'm saying, oh, this is good. Right? When I get in a car crash outside, God forbid, and I'm late to a meeting, and I spill my coffee or whatever it is, it's not that that's good. But you know what? This challenge that I have right now, this will also be good. Somehow, I'm going to be able to turn this challenge, this difficult situation, to be something good. That's what Gamzu Latova means. And because he always walked around with those words on his lips, he was given the name Nachum Ish Gamzu, rabbi of the time of the Mishnah. So I want to discuss for a moment, as you've seen by now, it's definitely a Jewish idea, passed down from Moses on down through the generations, eventually making its way to Rabbi Judah the Prince, and eventually going to Marcus Aurelius, where it's disseminated to the world, this idea of Stoicism. The question is, how do we do it? The question is, how do you do it? You know, we all have our difficulties in life, and for most of us, the knee-jerk reaction is when we have a difficult situation, we say, why me? Why is this happening? This is terrible. So how can we embrace this idea of Stoicism, this Jewish idea of Stoicism, to try and turn those obstacles, try and turn those nechsholim into something that can make us into better people? So I want to give you a few suggestions. Again, I'm just working on myself, and maybe they can help you too. So my wife always says a great line, that everything that comes across to us in life is either a blessing or a burden. Everything. And you know who decides if it's a blessing or a burden? You do. In other words, it doesn't start off as a blessing or a burden. It starts off as a thing. Who makes it the blessing or the burden? We do. I once heard from Tony Robbins, who I'm a big fan of, had such a great line. He said, we don't let our circumstances define us, we define our circumstances. Right? Our circumstances don't make us into the people we are, we make our circumstances. Blessing or burden, that is our decision. And I had the privilege in my life to see somebody and to interact with somebody who did this in such an amazing way. His name was Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel. Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel was a regular Jewish kid from Chicago, where Ari comes from. There's some other people in here from Chicago. Right? Regular Jewish boy from Chicago, went to Ida Crown High School. They called him Nate when he played basketball for the Ida Crown basketball team. And he happened to have come from an illustrious rabbinical family. So when he was a young man, he took a trip to Israel to visit his uncle, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, who happened to be the dean of the Mir Yeshiva, which at the time was a small yeshiva in Jerusalem. And Rabbi Pinchas saw something in little Nate, or he wasn't so little, tall, young Nate. He saw a tremendous potential in this Nate. And he was able to talk to his brother back in Chicago and say, you know what? Why don't you let Nate spend some time with us here in Israel? We'll send him back to go to college eventually, but let him spend some time here. This is before gap years or anything like that. So Uncle Banish was able to keep young Nate in Israel for a little while, and it really took for him. He became very close with his uncle. He started studying in the Mir Yeshiva, and eventually his parents let him stay a little bit longer, becomes a big Torah scholar. He goes onto the staff of the yeshiva, and eventually, when his uncle passes away, he actually becomes the dean of the yeshiva. And under his time as the dean of the Mir Yeshiva, he turned it from a small little institution that had escaped from Europe via Shanghai to New York to Israel, small little place, and he was able to build it into the biggest Torah institution in the world today of over 10,000 students. But there's something I'm not telling you about him. At a young age, he was struck with Parkinson's. And at that point, this is going back about 20 years, all the Parkinson's medications were known to, they could take care of the tremors, they could take care of the physical challenges that come along with Parkinson's. But he understood the side effects were it could make his mind a little bit dull. So in essence, he said, I'm not going to take any medication that turns my mind dull. I'll endure the physical hardship to be able to keep my mind sharp, because my number one asset to this institution, to my students, to the Jewish people, is to have a sharp mind. So yes, it means I'll be in pain. Yes, it means things will be difficult for me. Yes, it means I'll be trembling a lot. And I used to go to hear him speak, and literally he'd be sitting there. I mean, you can imagine with someone who has Parkinson's without the medication, what happens? Trembling all over the place. But he said, my mind has to stay sharp. He would interview all those thousands of students when they came for admissions into the school. He would interview each and every single one himself, lying flat on his couch, because that's the only way he could do it. When it was time for the yeshiva to raise funds with these challenges, he would fly to America to do fundraisers in the major Jewish communities. And through his sickness, he passed away at a young age, after he had literally given his life and soul to the Jewish people and built such an amazing institution. That is turning the obstacle into the way, saying, I'm not going to let it define me. I'm not going to let it slow me down. I'm going to turn this burden into a blessing and to be able to inspire others that no matter what challenges we have, they're there to make us better and they're there to make us stronger. Because in life, there's no winning or losing. There's just winning or learning. When we have things that seem like losses, that seem like difficulties, we have to understand that that's just a learning experience for us. I speak often about Steve Jobs. I don't like him I don't know him, but I don't like what they describe as his personality as a person. But I think there's a lot for us to learn from somebody like Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was a man who the cards were stacked against him in his life. He was abandoned by a teenage mother at a young age, put up for adoption, adopted by his parents. Had all kinds of challenges growing up, with being an adopted child and not really taking so well in school. Goes off to ashrams for a while, comes back barefoot after not taking a shower for weeks or months on end. And eventually he and his friend Steve Wozniak build this little computer that is kind of popular, and they build a company, they build Apple, and they build it up, and it becomes one of the fastest growing companies in America, essentially revolutionizing the concept of personal computing. But then in 1985, after the company had done their famous release of the Macintosh computer, the famous Super Bowl ad of 1984, no longer will 1984 be 1984. I'm sure we all remember that.
Let's take I-480 West.
We can take I-480 West and get to where we need to go. He had big plans for the company to move into consumer products. The chairman of the board and the board members didn't want the company to move that way. So what do? The man who literally built the company, they sent him packing in 1985. What does Steve Jobs do? He goes, okay, I've got my stock options. I got millions of dollars in the bank. I did a lot in my life. Okay, I'll go enjoy it. I'll buy a yacht. I'll buy a plane. I'll just enjoy the rest of my life. No. He turned around and he started another company called Next. And then he had this friend by the name of George Lucas who was going through a very messy divorce. And he had to sell off this little company that he had started at a discount price of $5 million. The company was called Pixar. He buys Pixar, develops it into the industry standard of animation. And after all that, Apple's falling apart. They beg him to come back, and he goes back and rebuilds the company. And in those years that he was with us after that, he built the company far more than it was ever built before, literally revolutionizing 6 industries. Because when he had the challenges, and there's many more along the way if you read the book, when he had the challenges, he didn't say, this is going to define me. He said, I'm going to define the challenge, and I'm going to make myself better, and I'm going to make the situation better. We all have light bulbs in our room, and I'm sure you can ask any American kid or adult where the light bulb came from, who invented the light bulb? Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison wasn't the only person in his time trying to invent the light bulb, trying to invent incandescent lights. There were probably hundreds of people trying to do it. But you know what? He was the only person who tried 6,000 times. He was the only person that when it failed the first time, he started over again. It failed the second time, he started over again and tried 6,000 times. So on that 6,000th time, he got the light bulb that we have today. That's why we remember Thomas Edison and we don't remember the other ones. And that's taking the obstacle. He always says, I didn't fail 6,000 times. I just had 6,000 learning experiences that got me to the point where I could make the light bulb. Because that's about not letting the failures define us, not letting the challenges define us. So how do you do it? You don't become a Renaissance Steve Finkel or Lahabdil Steve Jobs overnight. How do you do it? So the answer is it's got to be a conscious decision of building an inner citadel to say that I'm going to be prepared. So when I have these challenges, when I have these things come my way, I'm going to be able to make the right decision and to embrace it and to become better because of it. You know, there's a man walking down the street and he's carrying a nice cup of hot Starbucks coffee, and all of a sudden a lady comes running around the corner, bumps into him, and the coffee goes all over the place. You know why coffee spilled all over the place? Because he had coffee in his cup. Had he had tea in his cup, tea would have gone all over the place. And had he had Coca-Cola in his cup, Coke would have gone all over the place. We decide what's in our cup. We build that inner citadel in ourselves before the challenges happen. So that when the challenges happen, we can embrace them and become better people because of them. Many books have written about General Stockdale from the Vietnam War. General Stockdale was a man who was shot down out of his aircraft and taken as a prisoner of war by the Viet Cong. He was a top-level Army officer, and was the highest-ranking Army officer taken as a POW in Vietnam. So needless to say, he was tortured. He had a terrible time in captivity. He was often in solitary confinement. He was beaten. He was everything terrible that happened to him. But he made a decision. And the decision was made after his plane had been shot down, when he was descending in the parachute. He knew that the second he hit the ground, his freedoms went away. He knew he was a top-ranking general, and he knew it was going to be complicated. But he said, I'm going to define this situation. And I'm going to go in there, and I'm going to remain General Stockdale. And I'm going to be General Stockdale to every other prisoner of war that I come in contact with, and I'm going to help them to get through the difficult situation of being a prisoner of war. And he even developed a whole system, because the Viet Cong was notorious for torturing to try and, interrogation under torture. And he knew that people would break under the torture, and he didn't want them to feel bad for themselves. So he made a system of how they should reveal the information in the torturing. When it hurts this much, you can reveal this much. When they do this to you, you can reveal that. A whole system so that the soldiers would be able to embrace it. And not walk out of revealing classified information and feeling terrible. They stuck to the Stockdale principle. And one of the men that Stockdale influenced when he was a prisoner of war was none other than John McCain. John McCain, at one point, because he came from a big American family, had the opportunity to be sent home. And he didn't take it. Because he knew that he was being used as a puppet of the Viet Cong. He said, I'm not going home until everybody goes home. And the motivation, the influence to do that came straight from General Stockdale. And how do you become a General Stockdale? It doesn't come when you're descending in a parachute. That's when you can make the right decision. But it comes from years of building that inner citadel beforehand, making a decision that when challenges come, I'm not going to let them define me. I'm going to define the challenges. Number 3. The third thing we can do is try and become Stoic Jews. And that is iterate. Quite often in life, we're going through the process of whatever it is, working at our jobs, building a family, building a business, building an organization. And the challenges come up. And everything is clear that we have to pivot, we have to make some changes, we have to do things different. But so often we're so married to what we've been doing for so long that we don't want to change. And it's hard for us. But we have to be willing to take what we can get and to iterate when we have to iterate. And a perfect example of this is something that we ourselves in our lifetime have really seen before our eyes, and many of us lived through actually the beginning of it. And that is in 1947, the United Nations passed the Partition Plan. Now, if you look back at the Partition Plan and look at the map that was laid out of what was supposed to happen, the land of Israel was supposed to be divided into a Palestinian state and a Jewish state, and the Jewish state was militarily indefensible, It was mainly the Negev desert. It was separated down the middle. It was 9 miles wide at some points. A complete joke if you were trying to build a country, especially a country in a hostile neighborhood. But what did the Jewish agency led by Ben-Gurion say? They said, we'll take it. They said, we'll take it. Because you know what? It's a beginning. It's a place for us to start. We'll get ourselves in the door, we'll have a state of sorts, and we'll go from there. We'll go from there and see where it leads us. You know, Amelia Earhart had the same thing. When Amelia Earhart was offered the opportunity to be the first woman pilot and fly across the world, they said, you're really just going to be a showboat in the plane. You're not really going to fly it. We're going to have 2 experienced male pilots in there to fly the plane for you. And by the way, you might die. You want to sign up? You know what she said? Sure, I'll sign up. She took what she could get. She took the opportunity to do the job as best she could. And then she iterated when she could, and she became Amelia Earhart. Ben-Gurion accepted the partition plan, even though it was not a state in any way, shape, or form. But as we all know, the opportunities led themselves to the point where we have a very viable and defensible state that we've been able to defend for 71 years and to keep strong. That's iteration. That's looking at a situation and saying, we want it like this, the circumstances are this, therefore we have to change. To get from A to B, to get from where we are to where we want to be. We have to do things different. We have to pivot. Yeah, it's not what we want. Yeah, it's not what the Balfour Declaration promised us. Yeah, it's different. Yeah, it's all that. But you know what? We're going to deal with the reality. We're going to embrace it. And we're going to iterate as we go on to be able to make it into what we want it to be. And that's really what they do in Silicon Valley. Everyone ever heard of the concept of the minimum viable product, the MVP? That when high-tech companies look to put out a product, they don't look to perfect it right from day one. They want to put out the minimum product that's necessary out to the marketplace so the marketplace can help them refine it and get them to where they want to be to develop it into a great product. So in our lives, we have to look for the same thing sometimes. Yeah, we know we want to be somewhere. Yeah, we know we want to achieve something. But sometimes we just have to look for that minimum viable product, to take it, to embrace it, and to be able to iterate from that MVP to be eventually what we want to be. And the last piece of advice I want to throw at you is don't fall trap to getting overwhelmed. Again, talking to myself, but you can listen. Don't fall trap to getting overwhelmed. Because that is none other than the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination inside all of us. When we have the ability to do something special, and we have the ability to do the right thing, one of his or her tricks is to say, you know what? It's too big. It's too much. You can't do it. So don't even try. Don't even start. It's like the old saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. He says, no, you can't eat a whole elephant. And the Talmud in Sukkah describes a fascinating situation. Again, it's a homiletic idea. But the Talmud says that in the end of days, in the Messianic era, that the evil inclination is going to be slaughtered. It's going to be slaughtered. We're all going to see our evil inclination slaughtered in front of us. And the righteous are going to be crying, and the wicked are going to be crying. The righteous are going to be crying because they can be looking at their evil inclination slaughtered on the ground and see a huge mountain and say, how in the world were we ever able to overcome this? And the wicked people are going to be crying because they'll see their evil inclination sitting slaughtered on the ground, and it'll be like the thread of a hair. Let's say, how did we never get the strength to overcome that? Because for all of us, we have our challenges. And they always look too big. They always look like a huge mountain. But what's in the spiritual DNA of every single one of us is that we all have the ability to conquer what's given to us. If we're here, it's going to be smaller. It'll look huge. If we're here, it's going to be huge, but it'll look smaller. But the trick is not to get overwhelmed. Look at things one step at a time. Look at things one piece at a time. What do I have to do now? What's the next thing I have to do? What's my plan? And don't let the whole project overwhelm you. So I want to close just with one more example. One more example of where we really see this concept of Stoicism very clear in Jewish history. I brought you from Moses to King Solomon to Nachum Ish Gamzu, but I purposely left a gap in history for those of you who know Jewish history. I left a gap in history between Nachum Ish Gamzu and Rabbi Yehuda HaNassi before it gets to Marcus Aurelius. And that was the student of Nachum Ish Gamzu. a man by the name of Akiva ben Yosef, known to all of us as Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is a fascinating individual in the Talmud. He's fascinating because until the age of 40, he did not even know how to read the Hebrew alphabet. He was a complete ignoramus. He was a shepherd. And at the age of 40, he gets a certain inspiration. And he says, you know what? It's not too late for me. I'm going to go become a Torah scholar. And at the age of 40, he literally started from scratch. I mean, you can imagine the situation. He's 40 years old. He tells his wife, Rachel, he says, Rachel, I'm not going to be home for a little while. I'm going to learn Torah. Really? You don't know the Aleph base. How do you learn Torah? Don't worry, I'll start there and I'll move on. So he goes into the kindergarten class in the local yeshiva, and then they start learning the Aleph base, and they say, okay, Shlomi, why don't you read? Kametz Aleph, Kametz Beis Ba, Kametz Gimel Ga. Beautiful. Dovi, why don't you read? Kametz Aleph, Kametz Beis Ba, Kametz Gimel Ga. Beautiful. Akiva, your turn. Kametz Aleph, Kametz Beis Ba, Kametz Gimel Ga. Right? Like that's what it must have been. Literally starting from scratch. But in those 12 years, in those first 12 years, he was able to go from there to become the greatest scholar of his time, building an academy of 12,000 students. And you know what happens after that? He comes back home, he comes to greet his wife, and he hears his wife talking to a local neighbor. Saying, you know, your husband is such a louse. He left you for 12 years to go and study. What kind of husband is that? Left you here living by yourself. He said, what do you mean? Says his wife, Rachel. He says, what do you mean? He went with my blessing. And not only that, if he was here right now, I would send him back for another 12 years. Akiva, listening outside, here's he says, okay, boys, we're heading out. Goes back for another 12 years, builds an institution double the size, 24,000 students, comes back to the town, and they hear the big Rabbi Akiva's coming with all his students, and they're all singing, Yami, Mayavei, Melech. So he's right there happy, they got the big Rabbi coming with all his students. And all of a sudden, this little lady wants to come up and greet her husband, and then everyone's pushing her away, saying, what are you going up to the big rabbi for? Akiva from a distance sees what's going on and says, no, that's my wife. And not only is she my wife, but everything we've achieved, all of this is really from her. And he becomes literally the leader of the Jewish people. And then something happens. In a very short period of time, roughly 32 days, that whole academy is wiped out. It's a debate amongst the historians exactly what happened. According to one opinion, it was during the Bar Kokhba revolts and they were wiped out by the Romans. According to another, there was a plague that hit the academy. Nonetheless, all 24,000 students pass away in the period of 32 days. Now you can do your math for a moment and figure out how many that was a day and what that time period must have been like for Rabbi Akiva. Literally running back and forth from funeral to funeral, trying to nurse the students back to health, that trying to hang on to what he had. And after 32 days, they all perish. So we actually have a minor holiday coming up next week called Lag BaOmer. By the way, if you notice why I have the facial growth, why I don't usually have it, we're in this period of mourning for these 24,000 students. It's a custom not to cut your hair or shave during a period of mourning. But next Wednesday evening at our dinner, which you can still buy tickets to, it all ends with Lag BaOmer. Lag BaOmer is considered a holiday because that's when the students of Rabbi Akiva stopped dying. Now you can ask the obvious question. You know why they all stopped dying on Lag BaOmer? Because they were already dead. Right? You know, if you have 24,000 students and they all die and no one's left, why is that a holiday? They're all dead, they're gone. Yet we make a holiday on Lag BaOmer because the plague or the calamity or whatever it is seemingly came to an end. It came to an end because there's no one left. That's a holiday? That's why we have Lag BaOmer? No, that's not why we have Lag BaOmer. You know why we have Lag BaOmer? It's because of what came next. What did Rabbi Akiva do next? Now, imagine the situation. Would anyone have faulted him if he had just hung up his yarmulke, hung up his coat, said, you know what, I'm done, I tried, I lived my dream, I became a big scholar, built a big academy, it didn't work out, I'm going to retire, I'm going to go sit by the beach. Would anyone have faulted him? Not for a moment. Yet what did he do? He started from scratch. And he rebuilt his academy, this time with just 5 students. And it's from those 5 students that the whole corpus of Torah that we have today came. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is a student of one of those students. So is Rabbi Akiva Stoic? Well, if it's not clear from the story, let me tell you something else that he told us. There was once a situation where Rabbi Akiva was traveling, and he went to a certain town and asked for lodging, and they said, the inn is full tonight, you can't stay here. So he said, fine, I'll go camp out in the fields. And he goes to camp out in the fields, he builds a fire, and a big wind comes and knocks his fire out, and he doesn't have any fire. And what's Rabbi Akiva's response? It's okay, everything the Almighty does is for the best. Echoing that lesson of his teacher, Nochem Ish Gamzu. And then all of a sudden, a donkey comes and eats his chicken, so now he's not going to have eggs in the morning. And what is Rabbi Akiva saying? It's all for the best. Then the next morning he gets up, and he finds out that some bandits came to that town where he was supposed to stay, and wiped out the whole town. Had he stayed in that town, he would have been one of the victims. Had the fire still been lit, he would have been one of the victims. Had his chicken been alive to be able to go cock-a-doodle-doo, he would have been one of the victims. And he was able to see head on and say, this is a challenge. This is a nichshol. This is an obstacle. But through that obstacle, this is going to be the way. And I realize that truly, everything the Almighty does is for the best. And really, Rabbi Akiva taught us this in the quintessential lesson at the end of his life. At the end of his life, there was a time period of tremendous Roman persecution. And one of the laws that was put into place is that it was forbidden to teach Torah. But did that stop Rabbi Akiva? The man that saw 24,000 students go down and had to build 5 up to rebuild the corpus of Torah, did that stop him? No. He continued to teach Torah, even with the law in the books, and even with the punishment of death hanging over his head. And sure enough, one day he's captured, and he's sentenced to death, and he's taken out to be executed. Anyone who's ever been to Caesarea, that hippodrome out there in Caesarea, that's where he was executed. And they executed him in a brutal way. In literally a brutal way. And it was first thing in the morning they took him out to execute him. And as he's going out to meet his demise, he starts saying the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu. And his students say, like, Rebbe, we get it, you're stoic. Like, we learned the lesson. But like, this far, that you're about to be brutally murdered by the Romans, and still you have faith in the Almighty? And he said, all my life, I've struggled over the words of the second verse of the Shema. You have to love the Almighty, your God, with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your possessions. He said, I did it with all my heart in the academy. I did it with all my possessions. But I always wondered if I would be able to do it with all my soul. And now that I have the opportunity to do it, I'm going to miss it? I'm going to miss the opportunity? So as they go on to brutally kill our great teacher, Rabbi Akiva, he says the word, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, understanding the unity of the Almighty. Are there Romans today? The Romans are gone. You can go to the Arch of Titus. There's no more Titus to celebrate under that arch. Rome's a little nothing of a country now compared to what it once was. But Rabbi Akiva lives on. Rabbi Akiva lives on through this lesson of Stoicism and through the whole corpus of Torah that he was able to pass on to every single one of us so that there would be a partners in Torah for us to come to learn Torah. And that's the ultimate lesson that he passed on to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi passes on to Marcus Aurelius, and Marcus Aurelius passes on to the world and the way of Stoicism. So next time you hear somebody ask you, what did the Jews ever give to the world? Say, why don't you come over here and let me tell you the story of the Jewish roots of Stoicism. Thank you all very much for coming tonight. If you want to head on outside, there's a reserved baby going out. And we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Good one.